Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today marks the start of our Basics series. I've been lovingly calling this Grid Chat University, and while I cannot give you an official PhD in Formula One, I can teach you the basics that you need to know to get through a season. Whether you were listening to the podcast over the 2024 season, or you've been following me on social media over the last year, you know that what's really important to me is answering questions and creating a space where it feels like you can always ask those questions. And that is the goal with Grid Chat University. Starting today, we're using the off-season to break down the basics of this sport, with the goal that by the time we get to Lights Out in Melbourne in March, you should feel like you know pretty much the basics of the sport. Now, on top of my planned curriculum, so to speak, I have also been asking for questions from listeners, and you guys have submitted a lot of questions over the past week. Those questions span a lot of different topics in Formula One, so the questions that aren't automatically answered in what I would already be talking about, I'll be adding those to a question and answer section that goes at the end of each episode. So if you did ask a question and you don't hear it answered today, it may just be because your question applied to a different topic that we'll be talking about later on in this series, which leads us to what we're talking about today. Today, we're going to break down the way a race weekend works, and also what the points you earn in a race weekend mean, and the two different championships that we're competing for. By the end of this episode, you should understand how the race weekend is broken up, what's important about each session, and how the points you earn in a race weekend apply to the rest of your season. So let's dive in. We're going to start by talking about the very basics of this championship. Formula One has two different championships that happen simultaneously. Those are the World Driver Championship and the Constructors' Championship. The Drivers' Championship is pretty simple. The individual driver with the most points at the end of the season wins. The Constructors' Championship, which the same points apply to, is the team-based championship. So each team's Constructor Championship score is a combination of the points scored by both of their drivers. And also, one of the questions I saw asked was about reserve drivers. If there's ever an instance where a driver would need to be replaced, such as Ollie Behrman filling in for Carlos Sainz for Ferrari last season, the points scored by that reserve driver in that car would count towards that team's Constructors' Championship. So even if for a number of different possible reasons you saw a driver swap in the middle of the season, a reserve driver had to come in, or a driver was dropped and replaced, similar to Logan Sargent and Franco Colapinto last season, any points amassed by any of the drivers that are under that constructor count towards their Constructors' Championship points. So the Constructors' Championship part is the team part of the sport, and the World Drivers' Championship, which you'll also hear referred to as WDC, is the individual championship in Formula One. When it comes to WDC, one thing that's important to note is that is actually not what determines any prize money given. Now, winning the Drivers' Championship is great, but all of the prize aspects for the team actually come from winning the Constructors' Championship. Based on where a team lands in the Constructors' Championship, they earn a certain amount of prize money, and the higher you are, the more money that you receive. There are a couple of other aspects as to what you get from winning the Constructors' Championship, including your garage placement for the next season, and the amount of wind tunnel time you get during the off-season development. We'll get into wind tunnel time, aerodynamics, and what that means later on in this Grid Chat University series. But for now, all you need to understand is that there's two championships. One is an individual championship, one is a team championship, and both are determined by the number of points that a driver earns. But how do you actually earn those points? Let's talk about the race weekend format. There are two different types of race weekends that you'll come into contact with in Formula One. One is your standard Grand Prix format. We'll dive into that first. On a standard race weekend, we'll have 3 days. Those are usually Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, though some races like Las Vegas have a Thursday, Friday, Saturday setup. But 99% of the time, it's going to be a Friday, Saturday, Sunday schedule. There are a couple of different things that happen during a race weekend. On Friday, we have practice sessions. If it's a standard Grand Prix weekend, you're going to have 2 practice sessions on Friday. These sessions are called Free Practice 1 and Free Practice 2, though you may also hear them referred to as FP1 and FP2. During these sessions, all of the drivers are allowed to go out on the track for a period of time, and teams are allowed to run whatever setups they want to run. That means they may change things about the balance of the car, how low the car is running to the ground, and general different setups that the team may want to run to get data. Data collection is the core importance of these free practice sessions. Formula One teams build a car for the season, but each track has different elements to it, which means that the car's setup actually changes between the races. Some tracks have a higher elevation, some tracks have hotter conditions, and others have colder conditions. Some tracks are high downforce, some tracks are low downforce. All of these different things mean that the car needs to be tweaked between each race. And while the team at the factory is going to do their best to make their decisions based off of what they know about the track, there's no completely accurate way to test those setups until you get to the track, which is what we have these free practice sessions for. The drivers are able to get into the car, get data for the team, and also provide feedback on what changes they think need to be made for this race. So on Friday, you have 2 of those sessions. The team then takes the data they collect from both the car and the driver, and they make whatever changes they want to between each free practice session. So free practice 1, you may see them running a certain setup, and free practice 2, you may see them running a completely different setup. As a fan, you can watch these free practice sessions. They're televised, but there is one thing that I want to point out. Because teams are using these sessions to gather data, the lap times that you're seeing from free practice sessions are not necessarily indicative of how the race is going to go. You may see one driver hitting the top of the timesheet for all of free practice 1, while drivers that you're used to seeing at the top of the grid are not performing in the same way. That's because they're running different setups, and also because those teams may be trying to get different data. So you could be seeing any combination of tires, meaning one driver with a very fast time might be on a soft tire, while a driver that you're used to seeing at the top, like Max Verstappen, might be running on a hard, and a number of other tweaks that you could see. So me personally, I love watching free practice sessions, but it's mostly because I'm looking to see what teams are trying to change. What little tweaks to the setup are we going to see between each free practice session? What kind of driver feedback are we getting over the radio? And where are some of the problem areas on track that we might see for some of these drivers? So even though I might get some of that information, that may not be reflected on the timesheet. That being said, those free practice sessions are fun to watch. Moving on to Saturday, on a standard race weekend, you'll have one more free practice session in the morning, also known as FP3, which again will function the same way the other free practice sessions have worked. Following FP3, we have qualifying. Now, this session in particular is something that I received a lot of questions about. In particular, people who got into the sport on their own or through Drive to Survive never really understood the qualifying format. So I'm going to break this down in what may seem like really simple terms, but that's because qualifying can be really simple if it's explained properly. Qualifying is how we set the grid, or the order that the drivers line up in for the race for the actual Grand Prix. Every driver is going to compete in qualifying, and there are 3 sessions in qualifying. Those sessions are called Q1, Q2, and Q3. Q1 is an 18-minute session. All 20 drivers have 18 minutes to put their fastest time on the board. These are individual laps on track. We are not in a racing scenario. Instead, we're simply looking for the fastest lap time each driver can put in a single lap. At the end of those 18 minutes, the 5 slowest drivers are eliminated, and those drivers receive their starting place on the grid for Sunday based on the fastest lap time that they did. So the drivers who are eliminated at the end of Q1 will line up 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th based on who went the fastest. Now, Q2 functions exactly the same way, except these drivers only have 15 minutes to set their fastest time. So you have less time, but there are also 5 less drivers on the track that could get in your way. At the end of Q2, another 5 drivers are eliminated, and those drivers set places 11 through 15 on the grid based off of their fastest time. And then lastly, we have Q3. Q3 is made up of the remaining 10 drivers in the field and only lasts 12 minutes. Once again, on those 12 minutes, every driver is trying to put in the fastest time possible. And at the end of those 12 minutes, their places will be given based off of their fastest lap time. And that qualifying session has then set the grid for the Grand Prix that takes place on Sunday. Now, there are a number of penalties and infractions that could affect where a driver gets placed. But for the purposes of just talking about the race weekend format, the one I want to point out when it comes to qualifying is track limits. Track limits means that a driver exceeded the boundaries of the track itself. There are boundaries on both sides of the track that you cannot exceed with all 4 tires. And if a driver does exceed those limits during qualifying, it is an automatic deletion of that lap time. The idea behind this being a penalty is essentially that by leaving the track, you may have gained an advantage that allowed your lap to be faster than your competitors. Think about this like out of bounds in any other sport. In basketball, if you go to save the ball and you step out of bounds while doing so, you would turn over possession. In football, if you ran out of bounds and kept running for a touchdown to keep people from tackling you, that wouldn't be allowed. Track limits is basically the same thing. You've gone out of bounds of the track, gained an advantage, and your lap time in qualifying will be deleted. So that's why if you're watching qualifying and you see your favorite driver up at the top of the pack and then their lap time is quickly deleted and they fall back down, they most likely exceeded track limits. There are other penalties and violations that you may see awarded between the end of qualifying and the start of the Grand Prix, and we'll get into those in a later episode when we talk about the different violations and how the FIA works. But for the purposes of this, now we've gone through Friday and Saturday. Friday was free practice sessions, Saturday was a free practice session in the morning followed by qualifying in the afternoon, and then on Sunday we only have one session, and that is the Grand Prix. That day, all 20 drivers are going to line up based off of the qualifying grid that we set on Saturday, and then very simply, we head into the Grand Prix itself. Depending on the track that you're at, you have a different number of laps that have to be completed, different strategies that may come into play when it comes to how many laps you do before you stop. Now, depending on what track you're at, the number of laps that are actually completed is going to vary, but the runtime of a race is typically between an hour and a half and 2 hours, and the minimum distance of a race is 190 miles or 305 kilometers. There is one exception to this on the Formula One calendar, and that is Monaco. That track in particular is shorter than every Grand Prix on the calendar in terms of distance, and it's been granted an exception because of the history of that track and what it means to Formula One. And again, some tracks are going to be faster lap times, some will be slower. It all really depends on the track conditions of where we're competing. And the Grand Prix itself is going to be really straightforward. Whoever finishes the number of laps that have to be completed first wins the race. We'll get into penalties, red flags, track conditions, safety cars, virtual safety cars, all of those things later on in this basic series. But today you now understand how a typical Grand Prix weekend works, the order of those sessions and everything that goes on in those sessions. But at the beginning of this episode, I told you there are two race weekend formats. What we've just gone through is the standard format for a Grand Prix weekend, but some races throughout the season are what we call sprint race weekends. Those weekends look a little bit different. There's still 3-day weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, but on a sprint race weekend, drivers only have one practice session. That session is still the first session of the weekend on Friday, but it is the only free practice session that they'll get all weekend. That's because on Friday afternoon, free practice 2 is replaced by what we call sprint qualifying. Sprint qualifying works exactly the same way as regular qualifying. The only difference is the length of those qualifying sessions. So instead of Q1, we have SQ1 or sprint qualifying 1, and instead of 18 minutes, that session is only 12 minutes long. Then we have SQ2, sprint qualifying 2, and instead of 15 minutes, that session is only 10 minutes long. And then SQ3 or sprint qualifying 3, that session is only 8 minutes long. The goal is still the same. Every driver is trying to put their fastest single lap time on the board, and we still eliminate the same number of drivers in each session. So at the end of SQ1, we eliminate 5 drivers, and those drivers still take places 16 through 20 on the grid. At the end of SQ2, we eliminate another 5, and those drivers set 11 through 15. And at the end of SQ1, the remaining 10 drivers set places 1 through 10. So other than the sessions being shorter, sprint qualifying works exactly the same way as qualifying. So on a sprint qualifying weekend, Friday morning we have practice, and then Friday afternoon we jump right into sprint qualifying. Saturday morning, instead of having another free practice session, we have the sprint race. The sprint race itself is a 100-kilometer dash. This race takes place with no pit stops unless there is a disaster, and again, it's just a shortened version of the actual Grand Prix itself. Drivers are still awarded points for competing in the sprint, and the sprint itself is over on Saturday morning. That same day, we jump right back into the qualifying session for the actual Grand Prix. So on a typical race weekend, on Saturday, we have free practice 3 in the morning and then qualifying in the afternoon. But on a sprint qualifying weekend, we have the sprint race itself in the morning, followed by a qualifying session in the afternoon. And then on Sunday, just like on a normal race weekend, we have the actual Grand Prix. Now, when it comes to sprint race weekends, one thing you should know is that it's a very contentious subject. Some people really enjoy sprint races. They feel like they're a fast and exciting addition to the race weekend itself. It also provides to some people a little bit more value for a Saturday ticket if you decide to attend the race itself. But overall, a lot of drivers, including Max Verstappen in particular, are very anti-sprint format. There are a number of reasons for this. Max Verstappen in particular feels that it takes away from the excitement of the Grand Prix itself, basically saying that a sprint race tells you exactly what's going to happen in the actual race on Sunday. But aside from that, there are a number of reasons why a sprint race can be dangerous for someone's race weekend. And the two things that really comes down to are the loss of free practice sessions 2 and 3, and also the fact that the sprint race itself could cause damage to the car right before qualifying. There's a higher risk of damage and crashing when we talk about an actual sprint race versus what it replaces, which is a free practice session. And if a car is damaged in a sprint race, the team then has to rush to fix that damage prior to qualifying itself. It does make the race weekend a little bit more compact, and it also raises the danger of damage. However, it's also an opportunity to score more points and can be valuable when we're looking at the overall competition. Now, one thing I want to point out when it comes to watching the Grand Prix itself is that in the sprint race, you're not going to see anybody pit on purpose, but in the Grand Prix, you are going to see pit stops. Now, if you're coming from a sport like IndyCar, one thing you may not know about pit stops is that in Formula One, we do not refuel, meaning that the amount of fuel that you start with the race is the amount of fuel you have to finish it. An ideal pit stop is simply bringing the driver in, changing the tires as fast as you can, and releasing them back onto the track. However, if a driver has sustained damage, it's possible that you'll see the team change something on the car, replacing a piece on the car, for example, but the goal is for this pit stop to take as short of time as possible. And pit stops are something to also remember when you're watching the standings of the race. If your favorite driver is in first place, but everyone behind him has pitted, it's important to realize that a pit stop is going to take time off of their overall run for the race. And depending on how much of a lead that driver has, it's highly likely that during the pit stop, they're going to lose places that they then have to make back up. So while you're watching the race, remember to keep an eye on how many pit stops have been made and how many pit stops your driver has left to make themselves. That's going to lead to something that you'll hear the commentators talk about, which is that they are net and then a certain place in the race. When they talk about this, what it basically means is that if this driver was to pit right now, they would still be net whatever position they're talking about in their race. So say Lewis Hamilton is running first in the race, but he still hasn't pitted and a number of people have behind him. Based on the time gap that he has, you may hear the commentators say that he's net third for the race, which means that if he were to stop right now, take his pit stop and come back out, he would be projected to come back around third. It helps you keep in mind that even though the driver seems like he's running first, there is still a chunk of time that they're going to have to take to go into their pit stop and come back into the race. Now, whether it's a standard Grand Prix or a sprint race, at the end of the race, points are awarded to the drivers. These points are the points we talked about at the beginning of the episode when I talked about the World Drivers' Championship and the Constructors' Championship. In a Grand Prix, the drivers who finish 1st through 10th receive points, and the remaining 10 drivers do not receive points at all. The driver who finishes 1st receives 25 points. The driver who finishes 2nd receives 18 points. The driver who finishes 3rd receives 15 points. The driver who finishes 4th gets 12, then 10, 8, 6, 4, 2, and 1, all the way down to 10th. Now, a sprint race has less points to go around. Only the top 8 drivers receive points, with first place receiving 8 points and dropping down by 1 point all the way down to 8th. So second receives 7 points, third receives 6, and so on and so forth. All of the points that are accumulated throughout the season for a driver are the points that determine their standings in the World Drivers' Championship, and all of the points that a team as a whole accumulates determine the Constructors' Championship standings. A couple of other terms that you'll hear in a race weekend include podium, which means drivers who finish first, second, and third, as well as pole position or pole sitter. Both of those refer to the driver who had the fastest time in qualifying, meaning that they start in pole position, they are our pole sitter, or quite simply, they start the race from the first position on the grid. So those are the basics of a format of a race weekend. And now I want to talk about 2 listener questions that I received that relate to this. The first question, which was actually a question asked by a number of listeners, was what do the colors mean during qualifying sessions? When you're watching qualifying, you'll see the driver's time displayed on the screen, as well as a color that makes up about a third of the top of that time. Those colors that you'll see are yellow, green, and purple. Yellow means that that driver is driving slower than their personal best so far, meaning very simply that at another point during qualifying, they were driving faster. If you see that color turn green, it means that they're driving faster than their personal best for that session. And if you see that color turn purple, it means that they are driving faster than any other driver has driven during this session. Those colors are also going to be broken up into what's called sectors. Every track is broken into 3 different sectors, so you'll see those colors change as they go through each sector. You may see a driver go yellow in sector 1, green in sector 2, and maybe even purple in sector 3, though that would be kind of surprising. That also brings up the idea of fastest lap. During the Grand Prix, you can earn an extra point if you have the fastest lap of the whole race. It doesn't matter if you win the race, as long as that driver finishes within the points, meaning positions 1 through 10, and they had a lap that was faster than anyone else, they receive an additional point for that fastest lap. And then another question that a few people asked was specific to an instance with George Russell last season, which is this idea of being underweight. One of the things that you'll see at the end of every Grand Prix is the drivers check in for a weigh-in. They'll physically jump onto a scale with all their gear, including their helmets, still on. This is because there is a minimum weight requirement. At the end of every race, the cars and the drivers are weighed, and the driver and the car must add up to a minimum weight requirement. If the driver and their car were to come in under that weight, they would be disqualified. And that's what happened with George Russell last season. He and his car did not add up to that minimum weight, which means that he was disqualified. That rule is because in theory, if you're running lighter, you would have an advantage in terms of speed. So that's why you see the drivers jump onto a scale right after the race. So hopefully by listening to this episode, you now understand the format of a race weekend. One thing that's important to note is to watch Formula One, you don't have to watch every single session in a weekend. You don't have to get up at the crack of dawn and tune into Free Practice 1. And if you just tuned into the Grand Prix itself, that doesn't make you any less of a fan. But if you do want to tune into these other sessions, hopefully you understand how they work now. If you have any questions about what I talked about today or about Formula One in general, be sure to send those questions in. There are a number of ways that you can do that. If you're watching the podcast on YouTube, just leave your questions in the episode comments below. If you're listening to this podcast elsewhere, you can send in your questions a number of different ways. You can either head over to YouTube and leave your questions in the comments there, or you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads at Marissa Kumari. I'll also link to that in the episode description. If you find me over there, you can send in your questions via my Instagram stories, by sending me a direct thread, or by leaving a comment on one of the short form videos that I make about these episode topics. Regardless, if you send your question in, I'll make sure to answer it as we go through this series. Grid Chat University classes are in session every Monday until lights go out at Melbourne. So wherever you're listening, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode. And if you're not already subscribed on YouTube, you are missing some other content that I make outside of the podcast. Some of those videos include behind the scenes access that I've gotten, including watching pit stop practice in the Red Bull garage, having Paddock Club access, and a number of other really cool experiences that I've shared on YouTube. So make sure that you're subscribed on YouTube so that you get that additional content. And make sure to send in your questions, whether they're about this week's episode or about another topic that we'll cover later in this series. As always, I have been your host, Marissa Tandon, and I'll see you next week for Grid Chat University.